Greetings everybody, Draco here, and this might be a weird video. I'm going to try and defend the movie Morbius that was released back in 2022, which is part of what is commonly known as the Sonyverse. But before I start, here is a small summary of the original story from the comics. Although I will admit and disclaim, unlike other summaries I've done before, I haven't read much about this character as a whole, besides his first appearance in The Amazing Spider-Man from 1963 in the issue 101 and 102. So I'm just going to basically summarize that. In comics, Michael Morbius has a rare blood condition, which he has been managing with what he refers to as a serum derived from vampire bats. When he attempts to cure his disease with an experimental treatment involving electroshocks, something goes wrong, and the combination of the bat serum and the electroshocks end up changing him. He basically becomes a pseudo-vampire that has an uncontrollable urge to consume human blood, plus gaining typical vampire characteristics such as the power of flight, enhanced strength, speed, and a healing factor. He also has an aberration to sunlight, but it mainly makes him weak during the day, and also seems to stop his urge to drink blood. Side note here, unlike in the movie, Michael in comics regularly looks like his vampire form. Literally in the same story he's introduced in a flashback, he states how ugly he is. Now, as for the movie, it basically follows the same story more or less. Michael Morbius is born with a rare blood disease that strands him in a special facility that can keep him alive. In there, he becomes friends with a boy named Lucian, whom is nicknamed Milo and has the same disease. During their time together, they bond and grow to become like brothers. One fateful day, a machine used for the treatment malfunctions for Milo. In a desperate attempt to save his friend's life, Michael manages to fix the machine just in time. After this, Michael's genius is noticed by the hospital director, Nicholas, so he convinces Michael to develop such genius and use it for the good of humanity. Michael then makes a vow to Milo, in which he promised to find a cure for their disease. Years later, Morbius attempts a radical new treatment on himself with the help of his colleague and love interest, Martine Bancroft. Thing that has a horrible result, as Michael is turned into a pseudo-vampire, and now must feed on human blood to survive. Michael, after killing his crew, leaves Martine in order to keep her safe and to find a cure for his new condition. Along the way, Milo manages to get the same treatment that made Michael into a monster, but unlike him, Milo doesn't care if he has to kill people in order to survive, as he believes that he has suffered too much while others haven't. This leads to a confrontation between the former friends, which ends up with the death of Milo. The movie then ends with Michael on the run, plus some misplaced teasers for probable sequels and tie-ins. With both summaries out of the way, I will now attempt to defend this movie. Although let me be clear, I don't think this was a great movie by any means, but I definitely don't get why it was so disliked. If you ask me, I will pair up this movie with the okay movies of Marvel. Hell, I will even go as far as to say that Morbius is better than some Marvel movies, and definitely better than the Venom movies, that's for sure. I get that this movie has some superhero cliches, mainly cliches created by Marvel movies, like the hero fighting a villain with the same powers as them, or being incapable of remaining serious / having unnecessary jokes, but as far as those go, in here, they weren't too bad. Don't get me wrong, I have issues with this movie, and just to be fair, I'll mention them right away. First off, I didn't love some of the dialogue and scenes, like for example the whole interaction between himself and the goons he basically robbed for lab equipment, because at that moment, Michael is supposedly against harming others. I mean, that's the whole reason why he's searching for a cure, and why he was horrified after finding out what he did to his crew. So why would they portray him in this scene like an unempathetic asshole who is more than willing to use violence in order to get what he wants? Plus the whole I love this part of the movie that just didn't make sense in context of the scene. I think it would have been better if he was trying to negotiate with the criminals, but they were being assholes, and so they triggered him into attacking them, just so he could, by sheer force of will, hold himself back and managing to scare them away so he can get what he needs without harming anyone. That way, getting what he needs and showing his contempt against violence. There is also the whole dialogue between Michael and Martin when he is developing the poison to kill both himself and Milo. Because the whole to bats is lethal, to humans is deadly was just ridiculous. They could have just written it like, oh, it's lethal for bats, so it should be deadly for both of us, or something along those lines that didn't make it so redundant, I guess. Then there is the whole vulture thing. That is basically just the most stupid, cameo you can ever think of. How did he get his suit back? Why is he trying to team up with Morbius? Why would Michael care about Spider-Man? Like, if Michael got arrested and then, even though it would still be stupid, we saw him talking with the Vulture and he mentions how where he comes from there is a kid with spider powers but none of the bad spider traits. So Michael would figure that he could be the key for a cure for himself, and that's why he's interested in getting Spider-Man. That would make sense, but the way they did it just seems so rushed and crass. But as a side note, after thinking about it, I could see why the Vulture did end up out of his universe, because since the reason he's in prison and his history as a whole are so intertwined with Peter/Spider-Man, maybe the spell couldn't compensate for his presence in the universe, so it just expelled him out. It's not a flawless theory, but I thought it made sense and I just wanted to mention it. Another thing was Martin becoming a vampire, which was a bit odd for me. But from what I've read in the Marvel Wiki, Morbius did seem to have that ability to make others like him at some point. Other than that, it just didn't make sense to me. More so because the scene had her actively trying to make it happen, so it made it seem like she also wanted the power for herself and was ignoring the monstrous side effects. Thing that, according to the character we've seen during the whole movie, isn't cohesive or coherent at all. It could be interpreted as a desperate attempt to survive, but then she making it seem like she was sacrificing herself wouldn't make much sense. There is also the whole getting vampire bats from Costa Rica, which was never really explained. I did a quick search on this, and though vampire bats aren't common all the way throughout North America, there are some places in the United States in which they can be found. They also don't say what makes these specific bats more special than any other vampire bats in the world. So my theory here is that maybe they just wanted to go to Costa Rica and needed to excuse it in their budget expenses. I don't know. The last thing I have a problem with was how they never explained how Milo managed to use the serum on himself. Because in the scene in which Michael gets turned, he gets injected in a very specific place in his spine. So I don't know how Milo could have just figured out how to do it for himself, because either he did or he just injected himself in the leg, which would imply that the whole thing with the spine was just bullshit. So either the writers forgot or they didn't care enough to explain it. I guess since we know from the very beginning that Milo has some darkness in him, that maybe he had Michael's experiment under surveillance. But Milo then finds out about what happened in the news, so that wouldn't make sense. Ultimately, I just see this as a plot hole. Actually, one more thing I almost forgot. The whole bat kinesis thing was the stupidest thing I've ever seen. Why would bats completely ignore their own safety, their own survival instinct for these motherfuckers? Because remember, the serum didn't give Michael the power to control bats. It just made it so bats were cool with it. They should have made it so the bats answer Michael's call for help, as far-fetched as that may seem, and then just make them get in Milo's way so Michael could inject him with poison, instead of the bat Kamehameha they went with. Part of me wishes for this to be a self-aware moment and they just decided to go crazy, but it seems more like they thought it was cool, which is a bit sad. But that's about it. Those are the only problems I had with the movie overall. I heard people complaining about the whole cross-species genetic things, but it's a superhero movie, so there has to be some suspension of disbelief, at least in my opinion. Plot Plus, it is one of the key elements of the story, otherwise, they had to make it more accurate to the comics and make us believe that some sort of bad derived serum and electricity makes vampire. Which I guess wouldn't be so bad, but the explanation we got just wasn't an issue for me. There were also some complaints about the special effects of the movie. I thought they were fine. Mostly because I see the effects of when he moves around at super speed as the physical interpretation of how Morbius senses his own powers. So again, for me it was fine. But those are some small details I wanted to mention. What about the plot? I thought the story was okay. Like I said before, I didn't think this movie was the greatest piece of cinematography in existence, but I definitely didn't see anything bad with it. We have an underdog character with a bit of an ego problem trying to cure not only himself, but anyone afflicted by a rare disease. Thing that is already a bit of an improvement from his original story if you ask me, since in comics he only wanted to cure himself. One thing I really wanted to mention was how this movie has a subtle way of telling its story. Like they don't think the audience is dumb and can't figure out some of the plots by putting together context clues. For example, Michael being a genius. Instead of just saying, oh, he reads a lot because he doesn't have much else to do, they just made him fix a complicated piece of machinery with ingenuity, and since we know he has been around those same machines his whole life, it doesn't seem super far-fetched that a genius might figure them out. Another example is Milo. Instead of him just being the bad guy, we can see what twisted him, how being confined to a special facility because of his condition was unbearable, more so after losing his only friend. Plus being constantly reminded of how unkind the world is by the bullies at the beginning of the movie, because for sure they wouldn't just leave him alone after the incident, right? Then we see how Milo as an adult has become more reckless and unempathetic, to the point that we can see why he did the things he did. Even though they are inexcusable, we at least see a reason for why he's acting the way he's acting. One last example is how we don't need to be told, even though Michael is a bit egotistical and self-centered, that he still cares. Like with the little girl he's taking care in his own facility. Or how he literally dedicated his life to not only saving his friend, but everyone suffering from that rare disease. Also how he is his own biggest critic. How he can't accept the price out of a mistake he made, regardless of it having positive results. Again, I'm not trying to imply that this film is extremely introspective, but there were definitely some elements that got overlooked, at least in my opinion. Or maybe I overanalyze it, which could be the case. Overall, Michael is clearly a flawed person, but even though he is a bit full of himself, he still cares. He still wants to help, despite his hardships and despite his shortcomings. Not to mention Milo's story, that is sort of a dark reflection, how this type of life can twist someone's psyche, how it can break some and forge others into a better versions of themselves. In my opinion, it wasn't a bad parallel, and in general, it just didn't seem like a bad story. Yes, it has cliches and some poor writing, but it definitely isn't as bad as some would want you to believe. And I think that if you watch Venom or Venom 2 or Captain Marvel, Shang-Chi, or other of the few mediocre Marvel films/series, you owe Morbius a watch. After all, it's the best Sonyverse movie, and even though that isn't that high of a bar, it is still something. Not to mention how it 100% is better than the worst Disney has to offer. And yeah, that's about it. Hope you enjoyed the video, hope to see your thoughts in the comments, and I hope to see you next time. Goodbye.
like I'm king of